Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at biodiversity, why it's important and some examples you can use in your exam.
Hi everyone. Okay, so we're going to be looking at biodiversity today. So this is our definition. Biodiversity can be defined as the number of different species in an area or habitat. So remember, species is a group of similar individuals or similar organisms that can breed together, which just means reproduce, to make fertile offspring. And remember, fertile bit is important. It means that they can have offspring themselves. They could reproduce themselves. They are able to have babies or children. Another key word in this definition is habitat. So remember, habitat is the kind of non-living parts that make up the ecosystem. So the soil, the water, the air, the area, the kind of non-living area of the environment that these organisms live in. So it's really important that it's the number of different species. So an area is going to be more diverse if they have a greater number of different species. So let's take a look at an example. Here's my field. Say in my field, my area, my habitat, I have a 1, 2, 3, 4 different species. So each different shape here represents different species. So I've got my purple circle, I've got my blue triangle, I've got my pink stars, and I've got 3 white squares. So overall here, my biodiversity, or my number of different species, is 4. The total number of individuals is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, is only 9. So I have 9 individuals, but I have a total of 4 different species. So let's take a look at my second habitat. Here, I've got a lot more individuals. So I have 16 blue triangles and I have 12 purple circles. So in total, I have 28 individuals. So I've got a lot more individuals here. However, how many species have I got? I've only got 2 different species. So if we were thinking about which area, which habitat is more biodiverse, this area is more biodiverse or has a higher biodiversity because it has more different or a greater number of different species in the habitat. It is not just about how many individuals there are, because this field or habitat is less biodiverse or has a lower biodiversity because it has fewer, it only has 2 different species. It has half the number of species, so therefore it's less biodiverse. So that's what we mean by biodiversity as a definition, the number of different species in a specific area. Okay, so why is biodiversity important? What's the point of having high biodiversity? So any ecosystem that has high biodiversity will have fewer species that depend on just one other species for something. So it's this that's important. So we know from when we talked about interdependence that is what this is talking about. So if you only rely on one species for food, so if you only have one species of plants you can eat, or you only have one prey species that you eat, if that species were to disappear, you will have no food, so your population will decrease. If you can only live in one tree, then if all those trees are chopped down, then you will have nowhere to live and your population will decrease. So if you have a lot of choice, if there's loads of species, if there's loads of species that you can eat, if there's loads of species that you can shelter in, if there's loads of species that you depend on for something else, then if one of them disappears because of it dies for some reason, you will have other options. And so you and your population won't be affected, and then there won't be any knock-on effects. So that's basically what this is trying to say here. It basically means that in a large ecosystem with high biodiversity, there's fewer knock-on effects if one species disappears, or if 1 or 2, let's say, go extinct rather than disappear, because that's really what we mean here. So if 1 or 2 species go extinct or leave an area or completely disappear in an area, then there's fewer knock-on effects, so there's less of an impact. We talked about having good interdependence and having a long-lasting community and therefore stable things like predator-prey relationships, because then you make your environment, your ecosystem more stable, which means they can easily adjust to changes. And when we say changes, what we mean here is normally changes in, so environmental change. So let's look at a couple of examples. Our first example is over here on the left. We've got a coral reef and we've got a rainforest. Both of these have very high biodiversity. They have lots of species. Their species number and the number of different species in these small areas they pack into is very, very high. That means often they are very old, so they've been around for a very long time, and they are very stable. So removing a couple of small species here or there wouldn't make much difference. And if there are some slight changes in the environment, they're able to adjust, or that it will have less of an effect. On the other extreme end, we've got things like the Arctic tundra and the desert. So both of these have the opposite of the coral reef and the rainforest. They have very low biodiversity. They are often have very, very few species, and those species are often incredibly specialized and adapted to cope with these extreme environments. The animals that are really highly specialized in these low biodiversity environments are not easily able to cope with changes. For example, thinking about the polar bears and the melting ice caps, their habitat is changing. It's snowy and icy for less and less time as the temperatures rise for parts of the year. So they find it very difficult to hunt and find food, and therefore their numbers are decreasing. So actually the biodiversity is going to be getting even lower because of these impacts of climate change happening in these very specialized areas. The coral reef and the rainforest have their own problems. The rainforest is obviously they're suffering from habitat loss because we're cutting down trees, but that's not an environmental change that's a human change. And the coral reefs are suffering from bleaching because of the increased acidity. But coral reefs and rainforests have both shown that they can adapt and they can bounce back and come back very quickly if the changes that the humans are causing are prevented. Whereas it could take a very, very long time for the desert and the Arctic tundra to come back. Biodiversity is also important for humans. So the different range of species that we have and the biodiversity of the earth provides us with sources of food, industrial materials, and potential for new medicine. And also we use these natural environments as a place for recreation. So we obviously rely on food sources which come from the environment. So we require all of our crop plants to be pollinated by bees, and sometimes they also rely on other organisms. We obviously also rely on these plants and grow these plants to feed animals, which we also eat. So a lot of our food is dependent on various different species and also the species that they rely on as well. In many places, obviously, we rely on wood still as a main building material or a specialist material for certain building and construction work, and also all the materials that we have, so cotton and various other natural materials that we get from species and plant species in particular, that we use for materials, building, industry, and things like rubber was extracted from a plant, for example. All of those things that we use, oils for making things like toothpaste, palm oil, and all of that stuff comes from plant species. So we obviously still need to keep those species around so that we don't lose out on that ability to build and use those materials. Medicine, so many drugs, whether they're still made in this way or made synthetically now, have been extracted from chemicals that have come from plants. So in order to be able to potentially find future medicines and disease curing or even just symptom relieving treatments, we need to be able to keep investigating and keep discovering and looking at the chemicals that some plants create. And if we lose species, we are at risk of losing potential medicines and ways of treating illnesses in the future that could be extracted from plants we haven't yet discovered. Ecotourism. So initially, one of the main things is to keep natural environments safe and to maintain them because local people benefit from them. So people who live near those trees, mountains, parks, lakes, they benefit from being able to spend time, that's what we mean by recreation, spend time in those places and that can help mental health and all sorts of things. But also those unique environments, beautiful environments, and rare or specific wildlife bring in tourists. And that's something we call ecotourism. They come to see those places and those animals or those plants, and that with them brings income, which is obviously very important for the local area. In some cases, it's the only income that certain people in that local area will be able to get. So if biodiversity is reduced, we could lose all of these important species that we rely on for local people and local communities, but also globally. So there's some global things there like food sources, for example, which are shipped all around the world. So this is why biodiversity must be conserved. And we're going to talk a little bit about how people can start doing conservation as well. But also importantly, there are certain species that we can't risk losing, and these are called keystone species. If they're affected, they could cause entire ecosystems to collapse because they provide vital services to their ecosystems. So if we lost bees as pollinators, then so many plants around the planet would not be able to reproduce. And if they can't sexually reproduce, they would lose their genetic diversity, and we'd be without so many plant species, including crop species that we need to eat. Termites is another example. They, in large rainforests and places like that, start the decomposition process of waste materials. So like we talked about in the decay video, although fungi and bacteria do the actual breakdown of the nutrients, they first have to be kind of slightly broken down by worms and insects and other things. And termites are one of the important species that start this process, start breaking down wood and dead wood and other things in order so that they can start being recycled by fungi. Without that, if the materials didn't go back into the soil, there would be no nutrients for the plants to grow, just like we talked about in our nutrient cycle video, like the nitrogen cycle and the decay video. If anything that we do to impacts these keystone species, whole ecosystems could break down, because these essential services, not just part of a food chain, but something that affects really, really large communities, they are going to break down and cause potential collapse of various ecosystems. So let's think about how humans are having a little bit of an impact on biodiversity then. So this fact blows my mind, but modern humans have existed on Earth for less than 1 million years, which is less than 0.02% of the total time that life has existed on the Earth. So since life began, we have only really been part of it for 0.02% of that time. But in that time, humans have changed so much, and our population keeps increasing exponentially. So we keep increasing our global population massively, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down or stopping. So more and more and more humans are being born every day. So that means partly because we're living longer, because better healthcare has happened. Our increase initially when we started being able to produce more food, when farming happened and then the Industrial Revolution happened, we were able to transport the food better, store the food better, and so fewer people are dying of starvation and hunger. We fixed the basics, which just means that more people are surviving than dying most of the time. So our population is just increasing. What does that mean actually happens? Well, if we have more humans, we take up more space, physically, more space. We need more space to live, to build more houses, and we need more food. So then we need to use more land to grow more food, and we need more resources. So wood and things to build houses, and coal for fires and things. We need more resources. We start taking this space and the food and the land or the resources, the trees, whatever it is, from our environment. And so then we impact those species that relied on that space, those trees, that habitat that we've changed. And as our living standards have improved, so instead of going from living in huts and caves, we started building houses, and then we started building high-rise buildings, and then we've now got skyscrapers, and we've got ships, and we've got all sorts. And so as we've got more and more better quality of life, we consume more, and then we waste more, and so then we create more pollution. This has led to us having a really, really large impact on the environment. You can kind of describe it or plot it out in a little flow diagram. So we've got an increase in the population, and that leads to more people needing more space and more food. And then, so we clear more land for building and farming. So if it was forest, we chop down all those trees to make a nice flat space to build houses on, or to farm crops on, or to raise animals. So we've destroyed that natural habitat through deforestation, or we've changed it by rerouting a river, or we have built a dam or something. We've done something to change that natural habitat. We then do things like dig up the land, so we get coal, oil and gas, or peat or minerals, metals out of the ground, diamonds. All of that digging up is using the land and taking resources out of the land. And then also, because once we've used all those resources to build our mines, build our buildings, build our houses, our farms, we've using more energy and we're polluting more of the environment because we're producing carbon dioxide and chemicals and waste. So then that damages the natural habitats we've left by putting things into the sea, putting things into the land, the fertilizers leaching the land and into the water. So the natural habitat that is left around us is also damaged. And all of this adds up to us having an impact on natural habitats and ultimately decreasing biodiversity. So although numbers in populations constantly go up and down, and we looked at that when we talked about predators and prey and other biotic and abiotic factors that we've already mentioned, large decreases, more than usual decreases or sustained consistent decreases in the number of species and where they're found, so their spread or their distribution, is ultimately being seen by scientists at the moment in the last few hundreds of years actually, and has been sort of linked to things that humans are directly doing or things that humans are indirectly doing. So habitat loss as a result of deforestation or increasing land use for farming and building and things like that. Increasing pollution, so our increasing waste and where we're putting it in the air, in the water, in the land. Things like introducing invasive species, and we will talk about that in another video in more detail with examples, but why we put species where they shouldn't be and the impact that has on food chains. Overexploitation, they've got fish here as an example. Overfishing, taking too many resources from the land, whether it be food, animals, wood, trees, whatever it is, overexploitation. And then lastly, climate change. So climate change is the indirect action. So we know that humans are responsible for climate change by things such as CO2 emissions and other aspects of pollution that we are causing to the atmosphere, which is in result of that causing global warming, which has led to things like climate change, which is changing the temperatures, the weather, the patterns in that all of these animals and plants all over the world have been used to for hundreds of thousands of years. And those changes are having a big impact on biodiversity by decreasing the number of species. So humans are also, despite causing a lot of this biodiversity loss, they're also attempting to conserve biodiversity in places where it's being reduced the most. And we'll look at specifically some more detail about conservation in another video. But it requires the work of governments. So globally, the work of governments, charities, and individual people need to continue in order for us to maintain this biodiversity and not keep seeing it decline. So there's some things and some specific things that we can do in order to help maintain biodiversity. Firstly, have breeding programs in zoos for endangered species. So any species that is at risk of extinction, we are protecting it and preventing that biodiversity loss, those species from being lost and going extinct, by making sure we're breeding them and potentially reintroducing them into the wild. Using seed banks, so that's where we take seeds from plants and we sort of freeze dry them and store them underground safely, and they can be reanimated and replanted to bring back plants from extinction if they did go extinct, and also to maybe cross species and create hybrids that could be resistant to frost or things like that if those genes get lost through species shrinking or going extinct in various areas. Using global laws and protection to protect endangered species as well, so not just breeding them, but also preventing them from being further harmed. One example is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, so stopping people from being able to capture and sell for money endangered species. It's known as CITES for short. Protecting and regenerating rare habitats, so by making them sites of special scientific interest or national parks, so that people can't build on there, people can't use the land in a wrong way, they can't chop down trees, they can't poach or hunt in those areas, and that preserves the habitat. So one example is peatlands, so the boggy kind of areas where peat creates this unique wetland habitat. a lot of those in the UK are now sites of special scientific interest, so no one can damage that habitat, and we don't lose those specific habitats that only certain species can live in. Reintroducing hedgerows in agricultural areas, so not just clearing all the land for farming and then growing one species in a big field, because that is very low biodiversity. Then you've cleared out all the trees and the weeds and the bushes in the hedges, and you've just planted one species. So all those insects and small animals that used to live in the hedgerows and feed on the bushes and the seeds and the weed plants, they're all now gone, and you plant potato. And none of those animals can live in potatoes for shelter or eat potatoes. And you often spray chemicals to prevent animals from living there. So by putting the hedgerows back around the edges of the fields, we give space, habitat, food, and it stops us losing those kind of wildlife species that live in and around fields before we got rid of all the hedges. And finally, the major one is obviously trying to reduce deforestation and carbon dioxide emissions to try and reduce the effects of climate change and reduce pollution. There is another one, not quite finally. And some things that individuals can do as well is reduce, reuse, and recycle resources. So rather than just keep dumping waste and increasing our waste and increasing pollution and landfill, trying to find ways of being able to reduce our usage in the first place, but if not, reuse it again and again and again, like bags for life, or recycle things like batteries, recycle your tech so that it doesn't end up in landfill and those chemicals and all of the other things that ultimately leach out into the soil around it can be saved and stopped. Okay, so that was kind of a whistle-stop tour through what biodiversity is as a definition, what it means and why it's important, and what's actually happening to it in terms of a brief overview of the human impact on biodiversity. So this is an introduction. It's why it's important, but it links to many ideas across the ecology topic. This isn't the end of us mentioning biodiversity. So if you're going to look at more detail about all of the things we've talked about, because it links into all of these following topics, we've got measuring biodiversity in the practical side of things with QUADRATS. We've got to look at how land use and deforestation specifically affect biodiversity, including extraction of peat for AQA. Land water pollution as well, so looking at bioaccumulation and eutrophication and how water pollution affects biodiversity. Also looking at carbon dioxide, climate change, and more detail about how the greenhouse effect and how climate change changes the number of organisms and where they live, like migration patterns. And then also conserving biodiversity, so what specific conservation efforts are happening and how do they get around the issues with legal problems with trying to do this on a global scale. So all of this is coming up in this ecology topic, and all of this links to biodiversity. This video is not just what you need for biodiversity alone, it's a theme that runs through all of these topics. But I hope that was helpful as an introduction.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.